Glad you came back, or here for the first time. It doesn't matter. This is Behind the Photo. Subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments how you found this channel. By accident, or did someone send it? Now, quiet. The photograph is waiting. Enjoy the watch.
In October of 1864, 7 Confederate soldiers walked out of the Appalachian Mountains and surrendered to the enemy. They were not wounded. They were not starving. They surrendered in sound physical condition, with ammunition in their rifles and rations in their packs. The Union officer, who processed them, wrote 7 words in his report and underlined one of them. They said they needed to get away from the cave. What those 7 men found in the mountains of West Virginia was interrogated over 3 days by a military intelligence officer named Captain Wallace. The transcripts of those interrogations were sealed by order of the War Department in November of 1864. They remained classified for 125 years. When a historian finally read them in 1989, he immediately filed a request to have them reclassified. The request was denied. 3 of the 10 men who entered that cave never came out. Their names appear in Confederate records as missing in action, and then disappear from every document, every list, every archive, as though they were quietly removed from history. The transcripts are real. The cave is real. And what is inside it? In the second chamber, in the dark, in the rows, was there before the war began. Today, we find out what they found. 7 Confederate soldiers surrendered to a Union garrison in October of 1864. They were not wounded. They were not starving. They were not surrounded. They walked out of the Appalachian Mountains under their own power, in good physical health, carrying their weapons, and presented themselves at the gate of the Union garrison at Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, with no conditions, no demands, and no negotiation. They laid their rifles on the ground and said they wanted to surrender. The Union officer who processed them, a lieutenant named Edwin Marsh, age 28, noted in his intake report that the 7 men appeared to be in sound physical condition and that their uniforms, though worn, were consistent with active field service rather than the deterioration typically observed in deserters who have been living rough for extended periods. They had ammunition. They had rations. They had, by every visible measure, the capacity to continue fighting. They didn't want to continue fighting. They didn't want to continue doing anything that required them to remain in the mountains. They said they needed to get away from the cave. That is what Lieutenant Marsh wrote in his report. 7 words. They said they needed to get away from the cave. He underlined the word cave. He did not explain the underlining. The report was forwarded to the Military Intelligence Office at Harper's Ferry, and within 24 hours, the 7 men were in the custody of a captain named James Wallace, age 34, whose job was to interrogate Confederate prisoners for information about troop movements, supply lines, and defensive positions in the Shenandoah Valley. Wallace interrogated them for 3 days. The transcripts of those interrogations were sealed by order of the War Department in November of 1864 and remained classified for 125 years. I found the transcripts in the National Archives in Washington, Record Group 109, War Department Collection of Confederate Records. They were declassified in 1989 under a routine review of Civil War-era documents. A historian who read them that year, a man named Dr. Paul Whitfield, who was researching intelligence operations in the Shenandoah Valley, immediately filed a request that they be reclassified. The National Archives denied the request. I read this line in Whitfield's correspondence with the archives, and it stopped me. I have spent 30 years reading Civil War documents. I have read accounts of battles, massacres, prison camps, and the worst that men do to each other in wartime. Nothing I have read prepared me for the Wallace transcripts. I do not believe these documents should be available to the general public, not because they are classified, because they should be. The request was denied. The transcripts remain available. They are in Box 47 of Record Group 109 in the National Archives building on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. Tonight, we read them. The 7 men were identified in Lieutenant Marsh's intake report as follows. Sergeant Ezekiel Boone, age 31, of Tazewell County, Virginia. The ranking member of the group, and, by the others' account, the man who had made the decision to surrender. He had served in the Confederate Army since 1862 and had fought at several engagements in the Shenandoah Valley before being detached in the summer of 1864 to a scout unit operating in the mountains west of Staunton. Private Thomas Adair, age 24, of Wythe County, Virginia. Private James Pruitt, age 29, of Monroe County, West Virginia. Private Solomon Hicks, age 19, the youngest of the group, of Giles County, Virginia. Private Daniel McCoy, age 33, of Greenbrier County, West Virginia. Private Harlan Estep, age 27, of Mercer County, West Virginia. And Private William Caudle, age 22, of Buchanan County, Virginia. 7 men from 7 different counties in the mountain region of Virginia and West Virginia. They had been assigned to a 10-man scout unit under the command of a Confederate lieutenant named Garfield, whose first name does not appear in any surviving document, and who was not among the 7 who surrendered. The unit's mission, as described in the Confederate records that survive for this period. I checked the records at the Virginia Military Institute Archives in Lexington, and they are real, and the unit designation matches, was to conduct reconnaissance in the mountain passes west of Staunton, monitoring Union troop movements, and identifying supply routes that could be disrupted by Confederate forces operating in the Shenandoah. The unit had been in the mountains since August of 1864. For 2 months, by the account Sergeant Boone gave to Captain Wallace, the work had been routine. Hard, cold, lonely, but routine. They moved through the mountain passes. They observed Union supply trains. They reported what they saw by courier to the Confederate command at Staunton. They camped in the forests and the hollows of the Appalachian ridges, in country that most of them knew well enough from their civilian lives to navigate without maps. In late September of 1864, they found the cave. The cave was in the mountains approximately 18 miles southwest of the town of Franklin, in what is now Pendleton County, West Virginia. The unit had been moving south along a ridgeline when a storm forced them to seek shelter. Lieutenant Garfield sent Private Hicks, the youngest, the most agile, the one most willing to scramble down a steep slope in the rain, to find an overhang or a cave mouth where the unit could wait out the weather. Hicks found the cave. He came back up the slope and reported to Garfield that there was a large opening in the rock face, about 200 feet below the ridgeline, partially concealed by a stand of rhododendron, large enough to shelter all 10 men and their equipment. They descended to the cave mouth and went inside. Boone described the cave to Captain Wallace in the first interrogation session on the morning of October 19, 1864. The transcript records his words. Boone said, "The cave was large at the entrance, maybe 20 feet wide and 10 feet high. We went in about 40 feet, and the ceiling dropped to maybe 6 feet, and then it opened up again into a big room. Big enough that our torches couldn't light the far walls. The floor was dry. It was warm, warmer than the outside. which you'd expect in a cave, but this was warmer than that. Not just the absence of cold, actual warmth, like something in the rock was producing heat. Wallace asked whether they had explored the cave beyond the first chamber. Boone said, "Not the first night. The first night we just bedded down in the big room and waited for the storm to pass. The storm lasted 2 days. On the second day, Garfield sent Pruitt and Adair to explore further back, to see how deep the cave went, in case we needed to know the exits if Union troops came along the ridge." Wallace asked what Pruitt and Adair found. Boone said, "They came back in about an hour. Pruitt was, I'll say, rattled. Adair was worse than rattled. Adair's hands were shaking. I'd known Adair since Lynchburg. I'd seen him stand calm under artillery fire. His hands were shaking." Wallace asked what they had found. Boone said, "They said the cave kept going. They said it went deep, deeper than they'd expected, deeper than any cave they'd been in. They said the walls, after about 300 feet past the big room, started to change. The rock changed color. It went from the gray limestone you'd expect to something darker. And the walls, Pruitt said the walls weren't smooth anymore. They had marks on them." Wallace asked what kind of marks. Boone said, "Pruitt said they were cut into the rock. Carved. Not scratched. Carved. With tools. By someone who knew what they were doing. He said they covered the walls from about waist height to the ceiling, on both sides of the passage, for as far as he and Adair went before they decided to come back." Wallace asked what the carvings depicted. Boone was quiet for a moment. The transcript notes a pause. Boone said, "Pruitt said they didn't depict anything. They weren't pictures. They were, he called them arrangements, patterns, lines and angles and shapes that repeated and varied and repeated again. He said they looked like writing, except they weren't any writing he'd ever seen. And he'd been to school in Monroe County and could read English and some Latin. He said the marks on the wall were not letters. They were something else. Something that had the structure of language, but was not language as he understood it. I read this section of the transcript 3 times. The word arrangements stayed with me. Pruitt, a private in the Confederate Army, who had been to school in Monroe County and could read some Latin, looked at marks carved into a cave wall deep in the Appalachian Mountains, and the best word he could find for them was arrangements. Lieutenant Garfield decided to explore further. This is the point in the transcripts where the account shifts from reconnaissance report to something else. Boone's tone changes. The transcript records his words, not his tone, but the words themselves become shorter, more careful, as though he is choosing each one with the precision of a man walking through a space where every step matters. Garfield took 5 men, himself, Boone, Hicks, McCoy, Estep, and Caudle. Deeper into the cave on the morning of the 3rd day, he left Pruitt, Adair, and the remaining 2 members of the unit, men named Garrett and Shaw, who were not among the 7 who later surrendered, and about whom no further information appears in any document, at the base camp in the first chamber. The 6 men moved through the passage beyond the big room, past the section where Pruitt and Adair had found the carved walls. The carvings were as Pruitt had described, dense, precise, covering the walls on both sides. Boone confirmed this in his interrogation. He said, "Pruitt didn't exaggerate. The walls were covered, floor to ceiling, both sides, for what I estimated was about 200 yards of passage. The marks were cut deep, a 1/4 inch, maybe more. They were not old. I don't know how old they were, but the cuts were clean. The edges were sharp. In my experience, stone that's been carved a long time ago, the edges soften. Weather gets to them, even underground. These edges were sharp. They continued beyond the carved section. The passage narrowed, then widened, then narrowed again. The temperature continued to rise. Boone estimated that by the time they had been walking for approximately 45 minutes beyond the base camp, the temperature was comparable to a warm summer day, 75 or 80 degrees, which was, in the mountains of West Virginia in late September, at least 30 degrees warmer than the surface. Then they reached the second chamber. Boone's description of the second chamber occupies 4 pages of the transcript. Captain Wallace, who had been asking questions at regular intervals throughout the interrogation, stopped asking questions during this section. The transcript records Boone speaking without interruption for what the transcriber estimated was approximately 20 minutes. Boone said, "The passage opened into a space that I cannot adequately describe. It was large, larger than the first chamber. Our torches lit maybe 40 feet in any direction, and beyond that was dark. But it was not the dark of an empty space. It was the dark of a space that contained something. I have been in dark rooms. I have been in dark forests. I know the difference between the dark of nothing and the dark of something. This was the dark of something. The floor of the chamber was not stone. It was smooth, not polished. Smooth in the way that something is smooth when it has been worn by use over a very long period of time. I knelt down and touched it. It was warm, not cave warm, body warm, the temperature of skin. There were structures in the chamber. I am going to use that word because I do not have a better one. They were not buildings. They were not furniture. They were shapes rising from the floor, some of them 3 or 4 feet high, some of them taller than a man. They were made of the same material as the floor, smooth, dark, warm. They were arranged in a pattern, not random, deliberate, the way pews are arranged in a church or desks in a schoolroom, rows, facing a direction. I walked between 2 of the rows. The structures on either side of me were about 5 feet tall. They were wider at the base than at the top. They had no features, no markings, no openings, no decoration. They were just present, standing in rows, facing the same direction, in the dark. Wallace resumed questioning at this point. He asked how many structures Boone had counted. Boone said, "I didn't count. There were too many. The rows extended beyond what our torches could light. Dozens at minimum, possibly hundreds." Wallace asked what direction the structures were facing. Boone said, "Deeper into the cave." They were facing further in, like a congregation facing a pulpit. Except there was no pulpit. There was just the dark, and the structures were facing into it. And whatever was in the dark was what they were facing. Wallace asked whether Boone had continued deeper into the chamber. Boone said, "No, sir. Lieutenant Garfield ordered us to stop." Wallace asked why. Boone said, "Because we heard something." Wallace asked what they heard. Boone was quiet. The transcript notes a pause of what the transcriber estimated as 30 seconds. Boone said, "It was not a sound exactly. It was a vibration. It came from the direction the structures were facing, from deeper in the chamber, from the dark we couldn't see into. It was low, below the range of what you normally hear. I felt it in my chest before I heard it in my ears. It was, I will try to be precise about this. It was rhythmic. It had a pattern. It repeated. It was not random, and it was not natural. Rocks don't vibrate in patterns. Wind in a cave doesn't pulse. Water doesn't do what this did." The Harper's Ferry garrison was approximately 120 miles northeast of the cave. The 7 men covered that distance on foot in approximately 9 days, through territory that was actively contested by both armies, and in which a group of Confederate soldiers moving northeast toward a Union position would have been at constant risk of engagement from either side. They did not stop to rest except when physical exhaustion made it impossible to continue. They abandoned their heavier equipment on the second day. They ate what they could find. They drank from streams. They walked northeast with the single-minded determination of men who were not walking towards something, but away from something. The Harper's Ferry garrison was approximately 120 miles northeast of the cave. The 7 men covered that distance on foot in approximately 9 days, through territory that was actively contested by both armies, and in which a group of Confederate soldiers moving northeast toward a Union position would have been at constant risk of engagement from either side. They did not stop to rest, except when physical exhaustion made it impossible to continue. They abandoned their heavier equipment on the second day. They ate what they could find. They drank from streams. They walked northeast with the single-minded determination of men who were not walking towards something, but away from something. Private Estep described the 9-day walk to Captain Wallace in the second day of interrogations. He said, "We did not speak much. 7 men walking through the mountains for 9 days, and we barely spoke. It was not that we had nothing to say. It was that saying it meant thinking about it, and thinking about it meant some part of your mind went back to the cave, and going back to the cave, even in your mind, was something we had all silently agreed not to do." He said, "On the 3rd night, Hicks woke screaming. He was asleep, and then he was screaming. Not the way a man screams when he's hurt. The way a man screams when he's still in the dream, and the dream is he was trying to get away from something. We shook him awake. He didn't remember what the dream was. He said he just remembered the vibration, that it had followed him, that it had been in the dream, pulsing, and he had been running from it, and it had been keeping pace." He said, "After that night, none of us slept well. We took shorter watches. We kept the fire bigger than we should have, for the light. 7 armed men who had been through 2 years of war, and we kept a bigger fire than was safe because the dark felt occupied." Wallace asked Estep whether he believed the cave had followed them. Estep said, "I believe the cave was still in the mountains where we left it. I believe what followed us was the memory of the vibration. I believe that memory was put there deliberately. I believe that whatever was in the cave communicated with us, and what it communicated was, I know where you are. I know you left. I will be here when you come back." He paused. Then he said, "I will never go back. I would rather be hanged as a deserter than go back within 50 miles of that cave." Wallace noted in the margin of the transcript, "Subject appears genuinely and profoundly frightened. Not performance, not fabrication. This man is afraid of a specific thing, and the fear is recent and undiminished." Boone told Wallace, "We left the cave on the morning of the 4th day. Garfield did not want to leave. He said we needed to go deeper. He said whatever was in that chamber was..." He used the word significant. He said it was significant, and that the Confederacy needed to know about it. I told him I was not going back in. Hicks told him the same. McCoy, Estep, Caudle, Adair, and Pruitt had not even gone to the 2nd chamber, and they told him they were not going in. Wallace asked what happened to Garfield. Boone said, "He went back in. He took Garrett and Shaw with him. The 3 of them went back into the cave on the morning of the 4th day. The 7 of us waited at the entrance until nightfall. They did not come out. We waited through the night. They did not come out. On the morning of the 5th day, I made the decision to leave. Wallace asked whether Boone had considered going in after them. Boone looked at Wallace. The transcript does not record this, but the subsequent page includes a note from the transcriber. Sergeant Boone paused before answering this question and appeared to be deciding whether to answer honestly. Boone said, "No, sir, I did not consider it. I knew that if I went back in, I would not come out. I did not know this because of anything I saw or anything I heard. I knew it because the cave wanted me to come back in. I could feel it wanting me to come back in, the way you feel a current in a river pulling at your legs. And I understood that the pull was not something I could resist indefinitely, and that the only way to break it was distance. A great deal of distance. As much distance as I could put between myself and that cave, as fast as I could. I contacted the Virginia Military Institute Archives in Lexington. The unit records for the scout company that included Boone's unit confirmed that Lieutenant Garfield, Private Garrett, and Private Shaw were listed as missing in action, presumed killed or deserted, as of October 1864. No further record of any of them appears in any Confederate or Union document. They were not among the Confederate prisoners held at any Union facility. They were not listed among the Confederate dead recovered after any engagement. They simply disappeared from the record in October of 1864 in the mountains of West Virginia, at approximately the same time that 7 of their comrades walked out of those mountains and surrendered to the enemy, rather than remain one more night within reach of whatever was in that cave. The remaining interrogation transcripts, Day 2 and Day 3, cover the individual accounts of the other 6 men. Each was interrogated separately. Each told a version of the same story, differing in minor details of perception and memory, but consistent in every significant particular. The cave, the carved walls, the second chamber, the structures in rows, the vibration from the dark. Private Hicks, the youngest, the one who had found the cave in the first place, gave the most detailed account of the vibration. He told Wallace, "It wasn't just a sound, it had intelligence." I know how that sounds. I know you think I'm telling you a rock was thinking. I'm not. I'm telling you that whatever was making that vibration was doing it on purpose, and that the purpose was communication, and that the communication was directed at us. It was aware of us. It had been aware of us since we entered the cave. The vibration was not something that was happening when we arrived. It started when we arrived. It started because we arrived. I read Hicks's testimony, and I understood why Dr. Whitfield had asked the National Archives to reclassify the transcripts. Not because they contain military secrets, not because they describe a weapon or a strategy or anything that has tactical value 160 years later, because they describe 7 men, soldiers, practical men, men who had been trained to observe and report, encountering something in a cave in the Appalachian Mountains that does not fit into any framework that the War Department had in 1864, or that anyone has now. Private McCoy, the oldest of the group at 33, gave the shortest testimony. He told Wallace, "I have been a farmer and a soldier, and I have lived in these mountains my whole life. I have been in caves before. What was in that cave was not natural. I do not mean it was supernatural, because I do not know what that word means, and I do not use words I do not understand. I mean it was not part of the world I know. It was part of a different world, and the cave was where the 2 worlds met, and we had no business being there." Private Pruitt, the man who had first found the carved walls, who had come back with shaking hands, gave the second longest testimony after Boone. He told Wallace, "When I first went into the passage and found the carvings, I was curious. I am an educated man. I can read. I understand the difference between natural rock formations and deliberate marks. The marks were deliberate. I was curious about them the way a man is curious about an old book in an unfamiliar language. You want to know what it says?" he said. "The further I went, the less I wanted to know. Not because the marks became more threatening. They stayed the same. Same precision, same regularity, same repeating patterns. But somewhere around 200 feet into the passage, I had the feeling that the marks were reading me at the same time I was reading them. That whatever language they were written in was not written for my eyes, but that my eyes were being recorded by the act of looking. That by looking, I was being added to something, cataloged." He said, "I went back to the base camp. I told Adair to come with me when I reported to Garfield. I wanted a witness. Not because I thought Garfield wouldn't believe me. Because I was afraid of being alone with what I had seen." Wallace asked Pruitt whether he had any theory about who had made the carvings. Pruitt was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The carvings were not made by any civilization I have studied. I have read history. I know about the mound builders of the Ohio Valley. I know about the cave art found in Europe. This was neither. This was... The precision was too great. The consistency was too great. The marks at the beginning of the passage and the marks 200 yards in were executed at the same level of skill, in the same style, as if by the same hand. No human project over any significant distance maintains that consistency. The walls of that passage were not the work of people carving over generations. They were the work of something carving as a single continuous act." Wallace did not follow up on this statement. The transcript moves to the next question. I read the transcript 3 times, and I still do not understand why Wallace did not follow up. Perhaps he did not want to know what Pruitt's answer would have been. Wallace asked McCoy whether he believed the cave posed a military threat. McCoy said, "I believe the cave poses a threat to anyone who enters it. I do not believe it cares which uniform they are wearing, potentially injurious to morale. That is what the War Department decided. Not that the transcripts were fabricated. Not that the 7 men were lying or delusional, or suffering from the particular madness that war sometimes produces in otherwise sound minds. The War Department sealed the transcripts because their contents were potentially injurious to morale, which means, if you read the language carefully, that someone in the War Department read the transcripts and believed them. Captain Wallace himself wrote a covering memo that was attached to the sealed transcripts, and that was declassified along with them in 1989. I read the memo. It is 1 page in a precise military hand, dated November the 1st, 1864, 2 days before the classification order was issued. Wallace wrote, I have interrogated prisoners of war on more than 200 occasions during the course of this conflict. I have encountered fabrication, exaggeration, delirium, and genuine confusion. I have also encountered truthful accounts. These 7 men are telling the truth. I am certain of this, not because their accounts are internally consistent, though they are, and not because they corroborate each other in every significant detail, though they do. I am certain of this because of the nature of their fear. A man who fabricates a story about something frightening shows the fear of being disbelieved. These men show the fear of the thing itself. They are not afraid that I will not believe them. They are afraid of what they saw. Those are different fears, and they produce different behavior, and I have been doing this work long enough to tell the difference. He concluded, "I recommend that an Army Corps of Engineers team with appropriate military escort be dispatched to the Pendleton County location to investigate the cave described in these transcripts. I recommend this, not because I believe the cave has immediate military significance, but because I believe it has significance of some other kind that I am not equipped to name. I recommend it because 3 men went into that cave and did not come out, and because the men who did come out were changed by what they saw there, and because whatever is in that cave has been there long enough to carve 200 yards of writing on its walls and build structures in a chamber deep enough that torchlight cannot reach the far wall, and because I believe, as a soldier, as an officer, as a man who has spent 3 years learning to assess what is dangerous and what is not, that leaving this particular thing unexplored is a choice with consequences. The recommendation was not acted on. The transcripts were sealed 2 days later. The Pendleton County cave was not investigated. The Army Corps of Engineers was not dispatched. The covering memo was sealed with the transcripts and sat in a box for 125 years. Wallace's recommendation is still there, still unacted on, still recommending that someone go find the cave. No one has gone. The 7 men were held as prisoners of war for the remainder of the conflict. The order was signed by an assistant adjutant general, whose name is partially illegible in the surviving document. It appears to read Hartshorn or Hartshorn. The stated reason for the classification was contents not relevant to current military operations and potentially injurious to morale if disseminated. Potentially injurious to morale. That is what the War Department decided. Not that the transcripts were fabricated. Not that the 7 men were lying or delusional or suffering from the particular madness that war sometimes produces in otherwise sound minds. The War Department sealed the transcripts because their contents were potentially injurious to morale. Which means, if you read the language carefully, that someone in the War Department read the transcripts and believed them. The 7 men were held as prisoners of war for the remainder of the conflict. Boone, Adair, Pruitt, Hicks, McCoy, Estep, and Caudle were released in the spring of 1865, after the surrender at Appomattox. They returned to their respective counties in Virginia and West Virginia. None of them, as far as the surviving records indicate, ever returned to the mountains where the cave was located. Sergeant Ezekiel Boone lived until 1901. He was a farmer in Tazewell County for the rest of his life. His grandson, in a letter written in 1948 to a cousin, mentioned that his grandfather had never spoken about the war except once, and that the one time he spoke about it, he did not describe a battle, or a march, or a camp. He described a cave, and when the grandson asked what was in the cave, Boone said, "Something that was there before us, and will be there after us, and that we were not supposed to find. The cave has not been located." This is the detail that should, by now, be expected, but that is nonetheless difficult to accept. 18 miles southwest of Franklin, in Pendleton County, West Virginia, in the Appalachian Mountains. This is a large area. It contains hundreds of caves, many of them unmapped, many of them in terrain that is as difficult to access now as it was in 1864. The description Boone gave, a large opening in a rock face, partially concealed by rhododendron, approximately 200 feet below a ridgeline, could describe dozens of locations in that section of the mountains. No one has gone looking for it. That is the second detail that is difficult to accept. In 160 years, since the transcripts were declassified in 1989, no one has organized a systematic search for the cave described in the Wallace interrogations. Dr. Whitfield, the historian who read the transcripts and asked for their reclassification, did not search for the cave. He wrote to the National Archives that the transcripts should be reclassified. He did not write that anyone should go looking. The distinction seems deliberate. I contacted the West Virginia Geological and Economic Survey, which maintains records of known cave systems in the state. Pendleton County has more than 60 documented cave systems. The survey confirmed that there are additional cave systems in the county that have not been formally documented. Caves that are known to local residents or have been briefly explored, but have not been mapped or cataloged by any official survey. The survey estimates that Pendleton County may contain upward of 100 individual cave systems, of which fewer than half have been professionally assessed. The cave described in the Wallace transcripts: large entrance, concealed by rhododendron, approximately 200 feet below a ridgeline, approximately 18 miles southwest of Franklin, is consistent with the geology of the area. The limestone formations in that part of West Virginia produce exactly the kind of cave system Boone described. The warmth he described, the unusual warmth that exceeded normal cave temperatures, is not consistent with the geology of the area. There is no geological explanation for a cave in Pendleton County, West Virginia, that maintains temperatures in the high 70s in late September. The survey could not explain the warmth. They suggested an underground thermal vent, but noted that there are no known thermal features in Pendleton County, and that the geology does not support such a formation. The carvings they could not explain at all. The structures in the second chamber they could not begin to address because structures do not form in limestone caves. Limestone caves produce stalactites and stalagmites and flowstone formations. They do not produce rows of smooth, warm, deliberately arranged shapes facing a common direction, in a space large enough that torchlight cannot reach the far wall. Whatever is in that chamber was not made by geology. It was not made by water or time or the ordinary processes of the earth. It was made by something that had tools and intention and a purpose that 7 Confederate soldiers and 1 Union intelligence officer and 1 War Department official and 1 historian encountered across 160 years of contact with the evidence, and that none of them could name, and that 3 of them, Garfield, Garrett, Shaw, encountered directly and never came back from. No one has looked. That should tell you everything you need to know about what is in that cave. The vibration, if it is still there, if it has been there continuously since before a group of Confederate scouts stumbled into it in September of 1864, is still pulsing in patterns that Private Hicks described as having intelligence, directed at the empty air of a chamber that has had no human visitors since 3 men walked into it and did not walk out: Lieutenant Garfield, Private Garrett, Private Shaw. They went in on the morning of the 5th day. They did not come out. Boone waited until nightfall. Then he waited through the night. Then he gathered the 6 men who would still follow him, and he walked northeast for 9 days through a war zone, carrying his rifle and his ammunition, and whatever else he could not bring himself to leave behind. And he presented himself at the gate of a Union garrison and surrendered to the enemy because the enemy was a human being, and what was in the cave was not. The transcripts are real. Record Group 109, Box 47, National Archives, Washington, D.C. I don't have an answer for what they describe. I've looked. There isn't one. The cave is still there. Somewhere in those mountains, behind a stand of rhododendron, 200 feet below a ridgeline, there is an opening in the rock. And inside that opening, past the first chamber, past 200 yards of walls, carved with arrangements that a man who could read Latin called not language, Past the narrowing and the widening and the rise in temperature, there is a second chamber, and in that chamber, standing in rows, facing the dark, warm to the touch, and smooth from centuries of something that is not weather, and is not time, and is not anything that has a name. They are still there, whatever they are, facing whatever they face. And the vibration, if it is still running, if it has been running continuously, since before the war and before the mountains had names and before anyone carved the first mark on the first wall of the passage that leads to the place where the rows begin. The vibration is still waiting for someone to come close enough to hear it. The last people who heard it were 7 men in Confederate gray in September of 1864. They chose to surrender to the enemy rather than hear it again. That should tell you everything you need to know about what is in that cave, and everything you need to know about why no one has gone looking for it.
Thank you for reaching the last frame with me. Tell me in the comments what thoughts stayed with you after this story. I want to know what you'll carry with you. And subscribe to Behind the Photo. The archive is not closed yet.